Greetings. Welcome to ITR Live. I'm your host, Chris Hagen. We are back here in Studio 130 for another hastily prepared and quick on the draw episode of Iowa's favorite conservative podcast. I am joined here in studio with John Hendrickson with the wintertime vest on and Chris Ingstead rocking the sport coat. You both are far too overdressed for the ITR Live podcast, but welcome anyway.
Thanks. Well, when it came time to talk Iowa football and change the coaching staff, we knew we had to be ready.
Right.
Best foot forward. So we're ready. We're ready for the analysis.
We may have to have a special rapid reaction edition of the podcast here, depending on what happens here.
That's not what we're doing?
No, because I refuse to get my hopes up.
Oh, that those reports are...
Okay. The Iowa's offensive coordinator, Brian Ferentz, may be leaving. John, I'm not even going to ask. I know you don't have a take on that.
No,
so anyway, what else is on your mind, guys? And maybe if we can't talk about Hawkeye football.
I've been fired up about city and county officials whining about money since I read that article at like 6 this morning.
Yeah, I have thoughts.
Good.
John, do we just need to get right in today? Because I'm itching, I'm fired up, and I'm ready to go.
Yeah, no, we can jump in.
All right. Well, we've got two big things to talk about today, gentlemen. One, we've got this article that came out this morning in Axios Des Moines about local governments lamenting.
Yep. I think that's a good word.
The property tax bill from last year, and the Des Moines Register's caucus poll. So we're going to get to that. But since we're both really fired up on this, Chris, and I think John is too, I'm going to let you kind of set the stage for this article and about the frustrations of cities, specifically in counties to a lesser extent. Maybe that's not fair.
No, they had county. County
all right, they're both in there. So the title of this, and I want to get to this because I want to come back to this theme: tax cut consequences. The consequences.
Well, can I jump to the end? This was
take it away.
This was in Axios Des Moines, and jumped at the end. It said cities may have to cities and counties may have to find efficiencies, consider other options, and maybe make budget cuts. And I
sounds awful.
But isn't that the point?
Yeah.
I mean, if a tax bill is growing just out of control and objective data says that those tax bills are, and the legislature steps in to take action, yes, cities and counties, you may be forced to find efficiencies. You may be forced to make some choices. You may be forced to start discerning between wants and needs. But let's start with the premise of what happened. The legislature responded to, the input of Iowans that property taxes are just too high, and they're getting higher. And
Iowans' overwhelming anger at their property tax burden, right, John? I mean, we've been over this over and over. Iowans are mad. So, I mean, that's driving this, and it's not a Republican or Democrat thing. So, legislature responds.
Because the citizen complaints fell on deaf ears at the local levels. And so the legislature passed a series of reforms that added transparency to the process, and more importantly, had a number of ways to try to slow down the growth. And I want to be very clear about that. We're talking about slowing down the growth of property taxes. We're not talking about taking a meat cleaver to city and county budgets. They just don't get to collect as much more in the future as they would like to. Okay?
Correct.
And that seems pretty reasonable to me and to a lot of people. And instead, the cities and counties have immediately started the scare tactic. The Des Moines mayor sort of implied that this limited amount of growth may not allow them to fill potholes. Now, goodness gracious, they're collecting they're spending over $500 million on just sort of normal city services in Des Moines. You're telling me that $500 million, that's not enough to fill your potholes?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's false. Another one of the city managers, Des Moines city manager. Des Moines must have it tough, you guys. Mm-hmm. Boy, to be the biggest city in the capital city in Iowa must be a rough shape. I don't know where they're coming up with the money for their development agreements to build new things downtown, but maybe that's beside the point. But he was implying that, a 3% growth wouldn't help them keep pace with inflation. What's really interesting about that is cities and counties in aggregate have not only kept up with inflation for the past 20 years, but they have far, far exceeded it.
Mm-hmm.
And so to say, well, we're worried about keeping up, I'm like, what are you talking about? You've been blowing past it for 20 years. I mean, frankly, I hope we could scale down, but the reality is you've been you've been past that for so long.
Yeah. They didn't have any problem taking the ARPA dollars that helped create the inflation either. It's only a problem. The inflation's only a problem when it impacts your ability to keep spending however much you want, right, John? I mean,
that's right.
They never want to call out the actual problem of this.
No.
Now, somebody else talked about cities delivering mental health services. That's not really the city's function. In fact, I would argue that we've gotten to this place because cities and again counties have suffered from mission creep. They lost sight of what the real focus should be. And you make these decisions, you start expanding the scope of services you provide year over year. It compounds. And then you've got these inflated budgets, these type of budgets that far outpace inflation. And then somebody comes in and says, slow down. And they go, we can't slow down and the sky's going to fall. And it's just enough. You hit on this. This is the one that, and I know John's itching to get in here too, that bothered me about this is Cedar Rapids mayor saying we may not be able to do what we want to on mental health. Okay, back up a minute. Mental health care has long been delivered at the county level and is now paid for with state dollars entirely. It was never intended to be delivered by city governments in Iowa. But yet here we have cities wanting to be all things to all people with very little regard for who actually pays the bills. By the way, I think the federal government's picking up the check on a lot of insurance coverage for people who can't otherwise afford it.
Yes.
I think we'll maybe skip that fact
but
too.
I guess cities just want in on the game of getting to be able to provide a service that's provided at pretty much every other level of government. And yet when we ask them to spend a little bit less, they
talk about police and fire and potholes now.
Oh, okay. Well, I do appreciate that they've broadened the concern list from simply just going to police and fire every time to potholes and mental health services. I mean, look.
The foundation has an article up about this now, Chris. And, one other thing that article mentioned is the idea of reserve funds. Yeah. Many cities and counties are sitting on, just obscene amounts of cash that's free for them to spend. They've already collected it from the taxpayer. But instead of dipping into that reserve, they want to just take more from you.
Could they fill potholes with that money, Chris?
They probably could literally turn that money into dollar bills and fill potholes with it.
I wouldn't. Yeah. Okay, good. John, am I wrong on this? Or is... I'm thinking back to times that we have talked about this, John, about how they're just trying to scare us. And I think this time, they're being spun up on purpose. I think this is all part of a coordinated scare tactic on behalf of these cities to try and get people freaking out about the property tax bill last year. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, as we were talking this morning in the pre-production meeting, there's some news articles where you'll see local government officials, whether they're mayors or city managers, actually say that this bill isn't going to impact them at all. But yet you have a large majority of them that are, and we talked about this last week in regard to public libraries. Channel 8 ran the story of using Marshalltown as an example that libraries are going to have to cut their funding. And of course, Senator Dan Dawson was interviewed for that story and basically said that was ridiculous. And so I think this is a scare tactic used by the League of Cities as well as various local governments trying to defend their aggressive spending because they don't want to make tough decisions like the legislature has done in terms of budgeting, and also they do not want to answer the question about what are they going to do about property taxes, and they keep on raising the flag of local control, which again I think is a bunch of nonsense as well.
I'm coming back to what I have said many times. Local control has never been asserted once in an effort to save me tax money or to expand my freedoms. It is only asserted by local governments when they want to take more of my dollars and take more of my freedom. So that's my take on local control. So sorry, had to get that in.
No, you're absolutely right.
But we saw this. We've seen it around the state. It's not just this article, but we saw it. We talked about Henry County.
Yes. Yep.
And they were the local electeds are directed, go talk to your legislators and tell them how awful they've been, and this statewide push on it. But here's the thing that I think is absurd. If these folks genuinely think they're going to get the legislature to back up on last year's tax bill, I mean, that is, I hope they're not getting professional advice that tells them that's possible. And House Ways and Means Chairman Bobby Kaufman said in very plain terms that we are not backing up and we're not going. I mean, this was a bipartisan bill that passed the legislature last year, and frankly, wasn't even as aggressive as earlier versions of the bill.
No.
We're talking about $100 million here.
Yes.
Now, in terms of the scope of that, there's, I don't know how much sitting in reserve accounts statewide.
I think that we sampled a pretty good number of cities. The average of the sample we took was like 60%, meaning whatever their annual operating budget was, the average they held in reserve was 60%.
Many, many multiples of the 100 million that's being lamented in this bill. And local governments have $1.7 billion on the ballot this fall in bond referendum around the state of Iowa. This it's not that big of money. They just don't like being told no. But a bipartisan bill leaving the legislature to cut property taxes, which is a 70+% issue in this state with a lot of intensity behind it. The legislature is not going to go back in January and say, oops, we got it wrong. We need to raise property taxes now to make it right. So if these local governments think they're going to get this undone, I guess they're going to be disappointed again. They ought to come to the table and try and figure out how to make it better. But that doesn't seem to be the tactic. It seems to be going into the media and continuing to complain.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I don't feel any better. You guys were supposed to let me rant and rave and try and make me feel better. I don't feel better. I'm still upset.
Well, if someone's interested about their own community, they could go to ITR Local.
That's a great way. And you know what? We have found, we talked about the new ITR Local 2.0. We've seen a lot of folks using that data already, going into local elections here coming up in a couple of weeks, whether it's city, county, school board, a bond election. There's a lot of people that are consuming this information. So I'm hopeful that, look, again, if folks want more spending, they want the big spenders in their community, they want more debt, they can absolutely vote for those things. And at least they'll be well informed when they go do it. Right, John?
That's right.
One of the things that ITR Local uses to measure some reasons is the combination of population growth, or in some cases decline, and inflation, right? Because that kind of pokes holes in, because local leaders in that Axios article, Chris, one of them lamented inflation. The other said, well, this is tough on cities with a growing population, right? So we've said, you know what? We'll even concede that inflation and population growth might understandably push your budget up. So that's the reasonableness measure that ITR Local uses. And yet, Chris, over the last 2 decades, the combination of those two factors is a little less than 70%. The growth in property taxes collected by cities and counties is up 120%.
Yeah.
That is a big delta in between that in my mind just says stop complaining about population growth and inflation, because when we factor those things in, you guys are still taking way too much.
And I think it goes back to the focus is all wrong. The focus is on how they can make their own budgets work. How can we grow this budget and not on the family budget?
Yes.
If they cared more about it, those lines would be similar.
Yes.
And instead of complaining about inflation's impact on their city budget or their county budget, they would be out paying extra attention to the impact of inflation on their constituents' budget.
Having a discussion with somebody in person a couple of weeks ago, and they wanted to know, well, I don't really like what's going on in my community. I don't like the price tag keeps going up for my city, and city specifically, not looking. We broke away county and schools. And they said, what's going on? So we used ITR Local and pulled it up. Well, their debt service in that community is much higher than the average. That's information you can pull out of ITR Local. Quit building brand new shiny things that you think people want. Yep. Right? Or get a few other things paid off at least before you hit the credit card again.
Yeah.
But when you just keep going to the taxpayers and throwing debt on their backs, like this is what you're going to get.
Yep.
Could I just make one more point
Absolutely.
on this? And I think one thing that's forgotten in this whole debate is the issue of economic growth, and it's a concern for many communities across Iowa, especially in rural areas. We see, at least here in the metro, a lot of growth, especially in places like Ankeny, West Des Moines, and Waukee. But But we talked about last week the new tax foundation rankings.
Mm-hmm.
And part of those rankings, of course, we were in the top 10 for the highest property taxes. And I think
or again, as we like to think about, the bottom 10.
The bottom 10, yes, yeah. But we also, I think, forget that property taxes impact businesses. And small businesses are a major part of Iowa's economy. And in order to, and so a lot of communities, local government officials, if they want to see greater economic growth, need to start looking at ways to lower the property tax burden, because it's not only good for individual homeowners and property owners, but also for our small businesses. And so that's a huge issue for growing Iowa's economy and making us more competitive, is having a lower property tax burden for businesses to
quit making your small businesses fork over more and more money.
Right.
And so
Right.
I think that's one issue that these locals need to keep in mind.
I think it comes back to, again, and you're right, John, where is the focus? Is the focus on building and growing the budget, adding services, and trying to figure out the cost on the back end, or convince the taxpayer that it's all in their best interest? Or is the focus on the people that you serve and trying to give them the best life in your community that they can, and the businesses that there? Are you trying to make easier to do business or harder? Mm-hmm. Are you trying to make it easier to live in your community or harder? Or are you just trying to build new amenities?
In some ways, it seems like building for the sake of building.
Right.
You know, I can think of plenty of people in the metro that go, what does all this do for me?
Right.
What good does the shiny new building on the corner do for me? You know,
Right.
I've been here for 20 and 30 years, and you want to pay for the new building by taking more from me.
Right. Nope. That's exactly right. Okay. I suspect that we will have more to say on this.
Yep.
In the future. I want to go over, gentlemen, the Des Moines Register's Iowa poll, which released their latest poll on the Iowa caucuses. And John, do you remember? It's been several months since they released this before, right? I want to say it was even maybe back in the spring.
It might have. I think
was their
right.
last look at this.
Yeah, I thought August.
Okay, maybe it was August, but it's been enough time that there have been some changes. Yep. And just the top lines real quick. Donald Trump continues to far outpace the rest of the field. 43% of voters. Ron DeSantis 16, Nikki Haley 16, Tim Scott 7, Vivek at 4, and Doug Burgum at 3. You any quick takes on those numbers? Does that feel about right to you, John? Or
it does, yeah. I was very I wasn't surprised at this, and one reason for that is something that and I think I've shared this before on the program, is something that Newt Gingrich had said on the Laura Ingraham program, talking about former President Donald Trump. And he said, Newt basically said that President Trump is not just a candidate, he's a leader of a movement. And regardless of what anyone thinks of Donald Trump or America First type policies, as you both know, I tend to be pretty sympathetic to those policies. Trump is leading a movement that we haven't seen in quite some time. And so I think the Iowa poll and Trump's lead in not just Iowa, but in other states is sort of demonstrating that. The other thing I would say is the situations are, especially in terms of foreign policy, the war in Israel is benefiting a candidate like Nikki Haley, who tends to be more of a neocon, very aggressive in her foreign policy, and I think she's starting to give Governor DeSantis a run for his money. And we saw that they're tied, I believe, or close to being tied in the poll. And I think, Governor DeSantis, we saw late last week, is starting to address more foreign policy issues. He gave I would say, a fairly good speech at the Heritage Foundation and outlining his foreign policy I believe it was last Friday. And so I think the governor's starting to identify some of those. And I thought he hit some very good points in his foreign policy speech at Heritage, especially it made me feel a little bit better. He was hitting some America First themes and talking about the need to rebuild our military, especially our Navy. So I think majority of Republicans are in the camp of America first.
I think that's borne out by this poll. We've touched on this in the past. I know, John, you and I have, is that it seems like there's Trump over here that's well ahead of the pack, and then you've got DeSantis versus Nikki Haley, sort of for the Trump alternative spot in this. And Nikki Haley has gotten some momentum. She is certainly, I think since the last version of the poll, she went from 6 to 16. It's a big jump. I think the poll itself here asks how durable that is and how far has she really come. And there's a interesting, they ask a first or second choice question. And if you add up the first, second choice, or considering that candidate, Ron DeSantis moves up much closer to Trump, whereas Nikki Haley still is struggling, I think, to get that far. And they also measured enthusiasm. So how enthusiastic are you about your choice? And again, Trump leads that. If you're with Donald Trump, you love him, you're enthusiastic about him. But the Nikki Haley voters are actually much less enthusiastic, not just in raw numbers, but in that. And I think that kind of fits to with some of what we've seen here. One thing I was curious, there's a lot of, and they did this last time, there were a lot of independent voters in this poll sample. And there will be some independent voters, but it seems odd to me, like 20% here, 21, 22.
No, to be clear, to participate in the Republican caucus, you have to be a registered Republican or registered Dem on the other side. So if you keep your party registration as independent, no party, I think, technically, right? Well, then you don't get to go.
Right.
And so the term likely caucus goer seems like they maybe broaden that definition a little bit. At
its core, the caucuses are a party building exercise. They're to grow the Republican or the Democrat Party. And so you have to join that. I think Donald Trump 8 years ago brought some new people out. They had not previously been Republicans. They showed up, they became Republicans, and probably still are to this day. I think that's unique. I don't think very many candidates are able to really engage an independent swing voter enough to show up and participate. Definitely not a fifth of the electorate. Most of the folks that will show up at a neighborhood precinct caucus on a cold January night are the ones that have done it before. Mm-hmm. They know where it is. They know what the drill is. They know what they want to do and what they're. Yes, there's some new, but not 1/5 of the people that show up there. I just can't believe that. And among those people that the Des Moines Register's poll identified as independents are much more likely to support Nikki Haley.
I totally agree. In other words, if you let us define the sample of likely caucus goers, right, we probably don't let as many people in that gate as the Des Moines Register did.
Right.
And my guess would be those numbers would skew more heavily towards Trump or Trump and DeSantis, and Haley would lose a little ground.
Yeah.
Is that what we think, guys?
Yeah. I think that's right.
And I think you hit an important point, Chris, and that is energy. And that I was at a Trump event, and there was just tremendous energy in that hall in support of the former president. And it would I was at a sort of a breakfast meeting and just sitting with people that I met for the first time. I mean, just tremendous excitement and energy talking with these people as well. So I think that's a key factor that's mobilizing a lot of caucus goers.
Yeah, I agree. So I don't know that we know a lot new after all this.
Vice President Pence dropped out.
Yes. And I believe the article and the write-up, you read it a little more closely than I did. They didn't report Vice President Pence's number in here because he didn't register even when he was still in the race, right?
Yeah, it was 2%. So I think they just sort of divvied that up as people's second choice.
Yeah. I had just never made the case. There just never really was a given reason to be there. So yeah, and I suspect we'll see a few others drop out as we get closer to January. Okay. finally, I'm going to bring this full circle. I have breaking news as we conclude the ITR Live podcast. I do have a statement from Beth Getz, the interim director of athletics at the University of Iowa, that this will be Brian Ferentz's last season at the University of Iowa, but he will stay on the program until the end of the year. So there we go. We're breaking news here on the ITR Live podcast. Do you have that? Can you confirm?
I saw that too. Yeah.
Your sources are confirming that. Okay, good. May our long nightmare soon come to an end. John has absolutely no idea what we're talking about.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
But okay, so we need to wrap this up so we can go high five and celebrate sports. Right, Chris?
Yep, let's do it.
All right. Okay, well, thanks for joining us. Thank you, gentlemen, for your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Don't forget to give us a shout out or a review or whatever it is that you see fit to do. And with all of that, we will see you next time on ITR Live.